Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm Brandon Bloch. I'm an assistant professor in the history department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to a talk by Professor Magda Teter on her fascinating new book, Blood Libel, On the Trail of an Anti-Semitic Myth, which appeared in 2020 with Harvard University Press. Magda Teter is professor of history, and she holds the Schvidler Chair in Judaic Studies at Fordham University. She is a scholar of early modern European history, specializing in Jewish history, Jewish-Christian relations, as well as the history of knowledge. Her previous works include Jews and Heretics in Catholic Poland, A Beleaguered Church in the Post-Reformation Era from 2006, Sinners on Trial, Jews and Sacrilege After the Reformation from 2011, as well as numerous articles and book chapters on Jews and Christians in early modern Poland. Professor Teter's most recent book, Blood Libel, which she will be speaking about today, is based on a wealth of archival research in 8 countries and 10 languages. The book has been already recognized with the George L. Mosse Prize from the American Historical Association for the best work in European intellectual and cultural history, as well as the JDC Herbert Katsky Award for writing based on archival material from the National Jewish Book Awards. So it's a real treat to have Professor Teter with us today to speak about this book. The talk has been made possible with the generous support of the George L. Mosse Program in History, the Center for Jewish Studies, as well as Ken and Adriana Wiseman. And a special thanks goes to Skye Doney, the director of the Mosse Program, who has done all of the behind-the-scenes work to invite Professor Teter and make this afternoon's event possible. So first, Professor Teter will give a presentation on her book. I'll pose a couple of initial questions to get discussion started, and then audience members will be able to submit questions through the Q&A, which I'll read for Professor Teter to address. So thanks to all for coming. Without further ado, Professor Magda Teter.
Thank you so much, Professor Bloch. Thank you so much to the Mosse Center. It is really a great honor to be part of the series, and it's a tremendous honor to be awarded this very prestigious prize named after an incredible scholar. And ever since I've gotten the award, I obviously was thinking about George L. Mosse and his work. And I'm going to share my screen with you. And there were a couple of things that he mentioned that really put this book for me in a different light, or a new light, thinking in the context of his name and his work. Historians are creatures of their time. And I have to say that this book is a product of its time. When I first started, actually, I didn't even want to start it. I was finishing my second book in the Vatican archives, and I had a little bit of extra time and I didn't know what to do with it. So I ordered this manuscript about which consists of the trial records of Jews who were tried and then executed in the city of Trent in 1475 for accused of killing a Christian child. And this is a screenshot of what I wrote in my notes, and I just highlighted for you, not useful for me, but need to have seen. I was not planning to write this book. And when I finally decided to write this book, a book on blood libel, it was not intended to be this book that it turned out to be, and perhaps we wouldn't even be here today. You can see the first sort of outline of chapters from 2011. It was supposed to be only 6 chapters. The medieval period and the Trent trial was all bunched in one chapter because I thought everybody has written about the medieval blood libels, and about Trent, there's nothing new to be said. And the book obviously grew over time, but it was designed to really think about this map and explain this map, why in the early modern period, the area of my expertise, there were anti-Jewish accusations, blood libels in Poland, now obviously also encompasses territories of Ukraine and Belarus and Lithuania, but in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and a couple of other places like in Italy. So that was the first design of the book, very kind of circumscribed historically and geographically. It was not intended to take us on the tour of Europe, 8 countries, 10 languages, where it ended up. But the book's title, On the Trail of an Anti-Semitic Myth, is really a tribute to the trail of sources that I followed, that were one revealing the next and taking me on this tour of Europe. I wasn't particularly thinking about the contemporary resonance of blood libels, although in my sort of first pitch, when I was thinking, Sarah Palin happened to use the phrase. So obviously we early modern and medieval historians often jump on these contemporary relevance or incidents that seem our book appealing to modern audiences. So I collected these little screenshots and references here and there to these contemporary events as I was writing the book, but that wasn't necessarily what was driving these questions. As I mentioned, my questions were very, very historical. Until really the 2016 elections and the debates over truth and facts and why people believe in lies even when there is evidence to the contrary. And that is certainly a driving question for blood libel accusation. Why did people over centuries believe lies that Jews killed Christian children, when obviously there was evidence that they didn't? And then after I finished, and as my book was going into production, and it caused a little bit of a delay because I needed to mention that the shooting of the Poway synagogue near San Diego took place, and the suspect had posted a manifesto online in which it's a long screed, but I highlighted for you the passage related to blood libel. And he wrote, "You are not forgotten, Simon of Trent. The horror of what you and countless children have endured at the hands of the Jews will never be forgiven," as one of the motivations behind the shooting. So suddenly, not only in most general terms, but very specific terms, my apologies for the typo, is obviously 2019, not 2919. But very specific, the subject of my work. And then, of course, there is this all iconography, especially in the Middle East, that evokes the iconographic elements that are developed in the early modern period in the material that I was examining. And then after my book already went out, there was another flare up. And this again was with specifically references to blood libel. That's a painting from 2020 that was painted in Italy that prompted the Italian Catholic officials to issue statements condemning this kind of iconography in blood libels. Most commonly, if if anybody even knows what blood libel is, people associated this story with the medieval period. And it is true that the story does emerge in the medieval period, first as an accusation that Jews killed Christian children in reenactment of Jesus's crucifixion. And then in the 13th century, we have an addition of the so-called blood motif, that is that Jews kill Christian children in order to take their blood. And I based on my research, I created a list and eventually created a website with interactive maps. This is not perfect. There are other cases that for sometimes reasons because they didn't appear in the European sources and are only buried in the archives. Sometimes they may not be on this map. But what is striking is that in the medieval period, there were not that many of these stories, and secondary, the way we learn about them is from literary sources, that is from mentions and chronicles, from some kind of maybe poems, but they are rarely coming in the medieval period from some sort of legal or official evidence, whether it would be a papal letter or a period decree or even any trial records. So both in terms of the quantity and in terms of the quality of evidence, it appears to be very different from the early modern period that, as I would date more or less in middle of the 15th century with the development of printing press and other changes that are taking place in the 15th century. So it is striking that it is not a medieval story. It is in fact a very much an early modern story. And although this accusation, this myth, this libel emerges in the medieval period, it really becomes embedded in European Christian imagination, and also, as you can see, in legal proceedings and in the early modern period. I changed here back to the map that really was the beginning of the why there were so many accusations in Poland and really in the Catholic lands rather than the Protestant lands. And the previous map shows that there was still some early modern accusations, and Ronnie Pohya Shah has argued that Protestantism and also the sort of disenchantment with myths and magic lead to the disappearance of that in the German lands. But of course, they continued in Eastern Europe and also in a few places in Italy. What was really interesting, though, when I broke it down, is in the outcomes of it, that do we know whether Jews were executed or killed in a way, did they survive? And again, in much of the popular memory, but also in historiography, the assumption is that these libels have almost always ended up with Jews being executed for that. And the sources really really changed that perception, and there are some reasons why we remember the ones more and have the predominant impression that Jews were killed and murdered as a result of these trials. So here in the medieval period, again, not perfect data because it's only mentions in chronicles and a very few official documents. But even then, we can discern that in some of the cases, Jews were said to have been killed or executed, and in some they were not. But even in the early modern period, with the majority of these now we can often say cases of accusations took place because there were legal cases. Even then, the majority of them, the vast majority of them, ended up with Jews either being acquitted or freed in other ways. Doesn't mean that they didn't suffer, doesn't mean that early modern prisons and just the beginning of the trial and the whole process was pleasant. Torture was often part of the whole investigative process. But nonetheless, the majority of the trials ended in some way with exoneration of Jews. And the reason why we don't hear about them is that the majority of those trials that ended up in exoneration one way or the other of Jews have ended up being buried in the archives. And the ones that have entered the circulation of knowledge were the ones that that showed the Jews as executed, as punished for their crimes, their alleged crimes, obviously, but the way they were presented in these ways. So, so again, what is known, what is not known, what is forgotten is very, very interesting in the way history and historical sources are both present and how they transmit facts or historical information. So again, this is the medieval, the legal versus literary, and the early modern, which you have the shift into predominantly legal materials, and only a fraction of those are conveying this information through literary sources. And what it becomes very fascinating, that the trial that I said in the archives, it's not for me, I'm not really interested in that, but it was neat to have seen, came to be a pivotal part of the story. Scholars have studied it. There have been works in Italian, in German, in English about this 1475 trial of Jews in Trento. But it's a very instructive case on how facts are made. So in around Easter, Easter and Passover coincided that year. Jews were, Easter came in the middle of Passover. On the Monday, Thursday, this boy Simon disappeared, and people assumed that he may have drowned in the many canals of Trento, and that's what comes in from the early testimonies that are gathered in this case. But on Easter Sunday, Jews discovered the body of Simon washed up under one of their houses, and they notify authorities, and then the authorities immediately arrested Jews, and that's on May 26th. March 26th, sorry. By April 4th, before the trial fully begins, that is, until then, we have some testimonies being collected from different people. There is already a narrative created of the trial, telling exactly what supposedly happened. With Jews killing Simon for his blood in a celebration of their Passover, of their Jubilee, to crucify Christ, in anticipation of a messianic coming. So there are miracles, as you can see at the bottom, noted. So there is a very much a narrative set in. And the trial records were bound by a person who was being interrogated and investigated. What I did is I read the trial records chronologically, and it became very clear that with time, as the trial takes place, the language begins to correspond to the language of the narrative that was already existing from early April. But what the trial also did is it took place during a Catholic Jubilee, and a few decades after the invention of the printing press. And the local bishop wanted to really benefit from both and monetize on the Jubilee, on pilgrims traveling to Rome, and attract them to Trento, and use the new technology to disseminate these stories. Both here you have a broadside showing the miraculous nature of Simon's body and trying to attract pilgrims who might be seeking healing, or these narratives about the passion of Simon. And Simon's saintly status, you can see the race, was really dependent on the conviction of Jews. If Jews didn't do it, Simon was not a holy boy. So what we see is we have this dissemination of the narrative, And we have the development of iconography and the story. This actually book is quite revolutionary also in the history of the printed book, because it displays what is said in text displays exactly in image on the other side. It's not a generic type of imagery as we've seen until then. So each of those pages looks like that. I'm just showing you the images of how the story is told. Here Simon is being kidnapped. Here there is the so-called passion of Simon. And I didn't give you all of them. And it ends then in the execution of Jews. These narratives then entered very prestigious chronicles that were just emerging at the time as a genre of world history, from the creation to now. And here you have in Latin and in Italian, and the now iconic imagery. If you ever Google ritual murder or blood libel, that image will come up on both anti-Semitic and not anti-Semitic sites, but it enters the ecology of knowledge, of European knowledge. In the end, although in 1475 the Pope prohibited the veneration of Simon, in the end, with this relentless repetition of the fact that Jews killed Simon, Simon enters a newly reformed and liturgical calendar, Martyrologium Romanum, and gains essentially an official papal recognition. The case also developed the iconographic language. There's not really much iconography about these stories until Bishop Hinderbach of Trent invests a huge amount of money in depicting what supposedly he claimed took place in Trento. So we have three types of iconography. And that certainly is something that Italian scholars have worked on for a long time. The so-called martirio, that is the passion of Simon, then his dead body, it's called victima, known as victima, and then Simon in glory, that is the Simon who is the saintly boy. And what is interesting that iconography is very much regionalized. In Italy, except for the early period, late 15th century, but dominates the iconography of a saintly boy. Simon as a saintly boy, without the gore of killing, without the violence. You have the violence is alluded to in the elements, like on the right-hand side, you have the nails, the knife, the blood, the basin with the blood that sort of indicates the violence that supposedly happened to this boy. But in north of the Alps, in the German lands, and then later on also in Eastern Europe, you have much more of a focus on the gore, on the cruel aspect of the nasty aspect of that. So either the dissemination of iconography of Simon as the dead boy, and that is the iconography on the right-hand side that was also visible in a mural at the entrance to Frankfurt, or as in the killing of Simon, like the one from 1493 in the Nuremberg Chronicle, but far more popular. The Nuremberg Chronicle was actually, iconography was not very popular until the 20th century. Here you have examples of other types of iconography where depicting Jews in the act of killing. And that is what tends to disseminate, what tends to become very popular in north of the Alps. And here is just a map of this. You can see the glory dominates the south, and in Italian murder you only have in the south, but it's only in the 15th century, and north of the Alps, you have predominantly the focus on the corpse or the murder. So how facts are made, right? And many of those stories were lies. That is not necessary that Jews were tried and persecuted for these lies, but that the lies were invented, saying that Jews committed these crimes. I looked at my question eventually came, what did people know and how did they know it? And I examined these various chronicles to see what kind of knowledge about Jews you might gain if you were reading books that were available. So I looked at these very popular chronicles, and what struck me is that usually in the long history of from the creation of the world until the year they are published, they usually have only a handful of stories, but they have a very limited vocabulary in which they talk about Jews in that history of the world. That is, Jews are expelled usually for a reason, for some kind of reason. They do something bad. They mistreat the venerable sacrament. They kill. They pierce things. And then they are punished by expulsion or burning or other kinds of ways. So the vocabulary of what Jews do and what is done to them in these chronicles created a very kind of limited image of Jews and what their role in society and history was. And again, it was a sort of one of those eureka moments for me in my research when I began to see this. It was kind of sickening, to be honest with you. I had a physical reaction to it. But what it also did is I realized that we've been asking the wrong question. We've been asking, why did people believe the lies? And what really became clear, why are we surprised that they believe? If that's all they were able to see in the authoritative sources, in books that they were able to access. It was not that they were not that they were protected, right? So here you have some of the examples of marking the anti-Jewish stories in these publications, so that you as a reader, you are drawn to these anti-Jewish stories, that is, any stories that are included in these chronicles. Here is about the poisoning of wells, for instance. Here's my spreadsheet, which if I printed it in 100%, it would have been like 69 sheets of paper. So this one needed a magnifying glass to figure it out. But I was trying to map out the different versions of which stories entered which chronicle and how to kind of follow that trail of knowledge. What is also interesting is that, like today, not unlike today, like today, people get their knowledge from just headlines or Twitter, the short sentences. So too, people assume that knowledge and gain that knowledge from these one-liners, like here from the Martyrologium Romanum, which says that in Trento, in this, a child was, Simon, the boy, was killed by Jews. Just like today, our work as historians is not read by a large number of people. Neither was the work of serious historians read by people in the early modern period. And here's an example of how facts are. There's Mary Morgan, a scholar of sort of history of science and knowledge in modern period, had this idea of traveling facts and how they travel, whether they travel well or not. Here is a continuation of Cesare Barogna's ecclesiastical history by Odorico Rinaldi. And in it, he actually publishes the bull from 1247 defending Jews against accusations and condemning Christians for accusing Jews. But the bull is preceded by a short note that in 1247, Jews were accused of killing a Christian child in this town. And then the bull follows explaining why the Pope condemn it. This is a book, massive volume, multiple volumes, one per century. Nobody could really, except for libraries and scholars, could read it and afford it. So what we have is we have one volume abridgment versions of this history, and they delete all the primary source material and only contain the lines explaining the document. So here in this case, in 1247, Jews were accused of killing a Christian girl. And that's what enters. It becomes a fact, not that the Pope condemned the accusation, but that Jews supposedly did it. And both that kind of dissemination of knowledge, but also the fact that the church eventually recognized the cult of Simon helps explain this map. Why in the after 1580s we begin to see this proliferation of accusations, and also the end of papal protection of the Jews. I'm sorry. And here you have the end of the sort of Simon and glory and the dissemination of the gory iconography that we see. So what really, again, returning back to George L. Mosse and his meditation on history and his really work exploration of culture as a state of habit and mind, what I was able to see is how how those ideas about Jews were embedded in European Christian imagination, in European readers' minds. And then what was quite shocking, and it also ties to George L. Mosse's own shift from early modern history to the study of fascism and Nazism, is what I was shocked to discover is that these facts from the early modern chronicles, such as they were used almost verbatim by the Nazis in their Stürmer with footnotes to sort of beef up the claims about how cruel and horrible Jews were, and how they deserved what they may have deserved as Nazis were using in their propaganda. And what you see, for instance, on this spreadsheet is you recognize some of the imagery, Simon of Trent from the Nuremberg Chronicle, and the Bavaria Sancta that we've seen earlier. And then here is a 3-page continuation, spread almost analytic list of the supposed crimes of Jews from the time of Christ to 1932, exactly in the same way as the early modern chronicles were conveying that. And in brackets, they actually make references to specific early modern printed books from which the Nazis gleaned that information, again, to show that they are not inventing it, that they are not conveying lies in this anti-Semitic press. From that on, when the Nazis begin to use that image, this image from the Nuremberg Chronicle begins to proliferate in other European fascist and Nazi propaganda. Here you have La Difesa della Razza, a fascist magazine. Here you have Helmut Schramm's book for 1944, and a Polish version of a book saying the truth about ritual murder, which was published at the height of the final solution as part of the justification of what is being done to Jews. And then it enters the neo-Nazi, white supremacist ecology of knowledge, and both the quote-unquote facts but also the iconography, and inspires iconography in the Middle East, where, of course, blood libel as such did not kind of emerge until the colonial period. And that is where the shooter in Poway was getting his pre-modern knowledge. He wasn't getting it from obviously scholarly works, but was getting it from that neo-Nazi epistemic community. So are any lessons to be learned from this really grim? And I really became very depressed, especially as we were talking about confirmation bias and following the 2016 election, is that yes, leadership matters, and we could see it in the quality of anti-Jew and quantity of anti-Jewish accusations in the period where popes did protect Jews and issue condemnations, versus after, when they stopped giving papal protection against Jews. And that silence from Rome was seen in the Catholic regions, especially in Poland, as a recognition, and that coupled with the recognition of Simon of legitimacy of these accusations. So as we see in the medieval period, even though popes were condemning it, nonetheless, these accusations did take place. It doesn't prevent, but it did give tools to people who wanted to do something, or who wanted to protect Jews, to protect them. It gave them authority. The silence from Rome was seen as a tacit endorsement of these accusations. The other lesson and that might be our hope here, is that diverse sources of knowledge matter. And this map very much can be, this map and the iconography can be explained by the diverse types of knowledge. The German lands, which you can see is almost empty, entirely empty of such accusations, had despite the nasty, cruel, and violent iconography that emerged following the Trent trial, nonetheless had a diverse type of knowledge about Jews. And it wasn't friendly to Jews. These were, for instance, like polemical ethnographies that were meant to ridicule Jewish ceremonies and practices, and show how, how strange they are, and how they really should convert to Judaism, that their Judaism, what they practice, is not the original and true Judaism. It's corrupted Judaism. But they also had scholars who knew the Hebrew language. And even though they may have either used Jewish sources to prove the truths of Christianity, like Johannes Reuchlin or Johannes Buxtorf, who may have tried to provide the materials for polemical purposes and in order to convert Jews, nonetheless, they were familiar with Jewish sources and Jewish languages and law and practices, that they were able to say, no, Jews don't do such things. And in fact, there is even implicitly, like Buxtorf in his Synagoga Judaica, this Judenschule, he says about matzah, which was thought by some that Jews added blood to matzah for Passover. He said, no, Jews prepare matzah only from flour and water. They don't add anything, no fat, no salt. And he makes a sort of slight comment saying, and it doesn't taste good. People will disagree how it tastes, but that comment kind of implicitly stated that these anti-Jewish accusations are false. In Italy, the Italian anti-Jewish literature was, despite this story of Simon, was far more interested in trying to convert Jews and convey the truths of Christianity from Jewish texts. So we see the use of Hebrew texts in order to convert Jews. And in fact, the few times when these Christian writers did address the issue of these blood accusations, they would say that they are counterproductive, because why would Jews then convert to Christianity if Christians believe in such false stories? And it also can explain why in Italy the iconography of Simon of Trent focused on his glory and not on the gore. And that is because they were looking for these salvific kind of moments and hoping for the conversion of Jews. In Poland, where the majority of anti-Jewish accusations in the early modern period take place, there was none of that type of literature that we see in German lands or in Italy. The only thing that we see in Poland in literature that is specifically devotes attention to Jews is based on those chronicles that recount these stories that Jews did this or were burned or expelled or killed or committed sacrilege and so on and so forth. So the readers in Eastern Europe and Poland would, if they read books about Jews, that's what they would have been exposed to. For them, Jews were committing these cruelties. They were these cruel people. And then these stories justified the examples. And I was able to see in archival sources and trial records where there were actually references to specific books as evidence saying, oh, you see, Jews did that kind of stuff. In Poland, however, there were the largest Jewish community in the world at the time, and many Christians were illiterate, and these were the Christians who were closest to Jews, and we occasionally see them in court records defending Jews and saying, no, I am a servant and I have never seen such things. Jews do such things. The other lesson is that visual culture matters. And we know it today, and certainly how powerful images are. But again, this kind of iconography that emerges in Italy does not provoke the kind of violent reaction that you might get by looking at this kind of violent and cruel and ugly iconography that proliferates in the North that only can reinforce these anti-Jewish ideas. The other lesson that I would want to draw is that there was no uninterrupted line from the pre-modern to modern like the Nazis wanted us to believe. There was in fact an interrupted line. That is what we see in the 19th century in the development of our historical discipline. As historians are beginning to publish primary sources, chronicles and others, they begin to incorporate some of these stories into these chronicles, and chronicles are seen as sort of legitimate sources of historical knowledge, again in the modern period. And these stories again enter the now scholarly circulation of knowledge in the modern period. Also, 19th century accusations and trials of Jews that begin with Damascus affair in 1840, and then continue or research in Central Europe in the late 19th century, cause an interest in historical sources. And what we see is exactly the same documents that Jews would use to their defense in pre-modern trial being now published as evidence that Jews did not commit these crimes then or now historically. So both the defenders of Jews begin to explore the archives and begin to publish and republish and recirculate that early modern knowledge, and anti-Semites as well. So here you have, after the Hilsney affair in 1899, Maurice Stern publishes the papal bulls against blood accusations. During the Baylis affair, we have a whole book of primary sources that were published in Russian, looking historically at these anti-Jewish accusations. Cecil Roth publishes his Ritual Murder, Libel, and the Jew, and the translation of a report written in 1759 by Cardinal Lorenzo Ganganelli, then Pope Clement XIV, in response to the Stürmer that came out just a year later. So we see this dialogue again, going back to George L. Mosse's that were products of our time, and even our historical research, even about the pre-modern period, is very much impacted by what we're experiencing and seeing here. And anti-Semites too, like the Nazis, or here we have the resurrection of old stories, including redefinition of some of the popular stories in anti-Jewish terms, like the work on Saint-Vernier or Saint-Vernier, which was considered a patron of vintners, and then in the 19th century regains the anti-Jewish motif that had been lost for many, many centuries. Simon of Trent returns to the center of attention again with here is a 2-volume study based on archival research, again using modern methods of archival research, but for anti-Jewish purposes. So we see a very we can pinpoint the moments when both the past and the present clash, and the interest and that pre-modern knowledge enters the circulation of modern scholarly knowledge. And I'll stop here. I can pull out other things, but we'll see where the questions take us. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Teter, for such a rich lecture. I'm just going to pose a couple of questions, give you a chance to respond, and then we'll let our audience come in. Just a reminder, if you'd like to pose a question, please put that not in the chat, but in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'll read those. So just a couple of questions. This is such a rich and fascinating book to read. The first thing sort of picks up on your last point on the continuities from the early modern to the modern. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about the role of secularization in this story. So you show how the story of the blood libel in the early modern period is very much bound up with Christian theology. We can see this as kind of a projection of the Christian veneration of the blood of Christ onto the Jew, despite the Jewish prohibition against consumption of blood. So given these, how do we see the persistence of this myth as Europe becomes more secular? You talk in chapters about the Enlightenment, for instance, how Enlightenment authors like Cesare Beccaria reshape notions of criminal punishment, so change the way that blood libels can be addressed in trials, the use of torture. But the Enlightenment seems to have less of an influence on the blood libel myth itself. So the sort of status of secularization. And do Christian influences persist in later iterations of the myth? And my second question, then I'll give you a chance to respond, goes to the role of Poland in the story, which I found particularly fascinating. So oftentimes there's, I think, been this mythology constructed that really the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was the most tolerant place toward Jews in early modern Europe. Of course, Poland allows Jewish immigration during expulsions and persecutions from Western Europe. It's the largest site of Jewish settlement in the world in the 18th century. And oftentimes we think of the rise of modern anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe as being the product of 19th century nationalism. But again, you suggest these deeper continuities and in fact make the fascinating point, which you brought up again in the lecture, that blood libel accusations were in fact more widespread in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth than in the German or Italian states, because Poland lacks this tradition of Christian Hebraism that in Western and Central Europe mitigates some of the most egregious accusations against Jews. And then in the epilogue, you also reference the 1946 pogrom in Kielce. So some members of our audience might know Jan Gross's work, Fear, Anti-Semitism in Poland After Auschwitz, which deals with this pogrom where 42 Jewish refugees are murdered in Poland in 1946 following accusations of Jewish kidnapping of a Christian child. So again, these continuities are so fascinating, and I'm wondering here if you could speak about sort of what's at stake in your book about sort of contemporary debates in Poland and elsewhere in Europe on the historical legacies of anti-Semitism, especially as we're seeing increasingly in Poland and other parts of Europe attempts to silence critical historians sort of looking at anti-Semitic heritage. So two themes, the question of secularization and the role of Poland in your story, I found especially fascinating, and perhaps you could reflect a bit on that, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And again, please put those in the Q&A.
These are great questions, and there are a couple of things about the Enlightenment and that I want to say. One of the fascinating things that I discovered is that we have often heard about these accusations as a product of the uneducated, of the riffraff, of the rabble, of the uncultured people. And what is really fascinating is that it was a product of the cultured people, that the illiterate Christians who, they knew these stories that was circulating in one way or the other, probably through oral tales, through maybe visits to some of the sites, or going through, towns, or maybe through rumors. But we see that that it is through books that the knowledge of the pattern and thinking about Jews emerges. And I'll give you one example, two examples I'll give you. One is an early 18th century scholar saying that, oh, I went, to the West, and I encountered these chronicles, and I read about all these things the Jews do. And my God, I used to drink with Jews. I used to go and hang out in the taverns, and it's a wonder that I'm still alive, right? So he didn't know it until he encountered that in books, and then he began to see Jews through the prism of that knowledge. In the 18th century, we see a shift again in that condemnation that all knowledge is something that gives you enlightenment, that you don't believe in superstitions. And we see that shift saying, oh, this must come from uneducated people. So that myth, that becomes a myth, that becomes a kind of Enlightenment ethos myth, that knowledge only leads to better things. But in fact, it doesn't always lead to better things. And that myth emerges in the Enlightenment era, and it also is projected onto the causes of the blood libel or misreading the causes of the anti-Jewish accusations. The other thing about modern times, so this is interesting about secularization, is obviously, people, religion doesn't disappear. We now know that religion doesn't disappear after the Enlightenment, and continues to be a social and cultural factor in Europe. But what does change is the framing of these accusations, and they are more focused on cruelty. They are more focused on, for instance, accusations of Jews murdering Christian women. And that has more to do with the transformations of society and women becoming more independent, that begins to pose the danger of the world and these sort of whether sexual or cross-cultural, cross-social relations, as Jews are more formally integrated into the society. The second question you asked was about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And it is true that the Jews had privileges, and that they were welcomed, and they thrived in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But it is also true that existence was not free from persecution, and part of that story is, and what is fascinating, and really again, I was able to pinpoint the moment when the convictions of Jews increased. That is, we have the first examples of anti-Jewish accusations in Poland in the sort of early mid-16th century, but it's after the publication of the first anti-Jewish book on Jewish cruelties that we see a shift in convictions of Jews, and that becomes part of that kind of knowledge and culture of what is known about Jews, but again, only among certain group of people, because I could see in these various trial records where uneducated people were heard, whose voices were preserved in a certain way, that they often came in defense of Jews, and they would know, they would trigger. So what was interesting is you had to be attuned to what triggered these accusations. That is, not every spring when a Christian child drowned or disappeared or was hit by something and was killed, that Jews were automatically accused. And there was a lot of infant death. Infanticide was well-known a crime, and there was a lot of infant death. Not every dead child led to an accusation. And looking at those factors became very, very useful, because you could see both the pervasiveness of knowledge that of these rumors and these stories. Oh, didn't they say that Jews do these things? And then when is it actually, to use a common term these days, weaponized for political reasons against Jews in these various towns. So it becomes part of that. But at the same time, when we see the legal reforms and the end of persecution of Jews and the end of torture, that doesn't mean that the belief doesn't disappear, right? And there is a scholar in Poland, Jolanta Zindel, who has written a fantastic book on the 19th century, various sort of accusations and iterations of that. And then Elisa Ben-Porad has written a book on the Soviet period and in the Soviet Union. So it doesn't disappear, but that pre-modern knowledge is then used, again, as I said, much like the rumors exist and that common knowledge exists, but it's only in certain times when it's weaponized for these trials in the pre-modern period. Similarly, in the modern period, that pre-modern knowledge and that those ideas are only kind of resurfacing in certain moments, which I found fascinating, that all my primary sources that were published in the 19th century, many of them are now lost because of wars from the archives and so on and so forth, were published in response to these modern accusations, right? So it raises all kinds of questions for us historians of where our sources are coming from and why do we have them? Why do they resurface?
Great. Well, thank you so much.